very special pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker, Podia. Though I did not have the pleasure of knowing Father Schemel, the fact is that the program that I direct was begun by a distinguished oncologist, you all know him, whose life was changed and enhanced by him. That was Harmer Brereton, founded the series of programs that we now call the Schemel Forum, to enhance and enlighten the intellectual and cultural life of our city. Harmer expected to be here today, but a health issue made it impossible. He's certainly with us in spirit. I spoke to him yesterday and asked him to say a few words. Among the George, as was his ability to teach, he continued. When I think of the gift that George was, I think of the word of the Gospel of Matthew. Knock and it will be opened. Seek and you will find. Ask and you will receive, as was his ability to teach. He continued, when I think of the gift that was
have some voice. Well, it's a Monday evening here in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Technology, east as it is in the south. My talk's going to be way more interesting than my brother's, in case you're interested. Your vote on that afterwards. In the end, we're still brothers, right? So, not working? Okay. Welcome to. Okay, well, hi, and talk about my uncle. Whatever, but you know the impact he's had on you. But this really, when I went back putting this talk together, I want to read this because I think it's from his obituary. It's the third paragraph. It says, Father Schemel was an extraordinary teacher who gave himself wholeheartedly to the study of spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola. Over the years, he directed hundreds of individuals, guiding them and deepening their spiritual life. He was respected within the United States and abroad for his spiritual direction and the gift he had for assisting men and women, religious and lay, to discern the frequently difficult decisions in life they were called upon to make. He was a frequent advisor to medical, civic business groups in the Scranton area. So that is quite a heavy, load to read about your uncle, that he had such a worldwide reach. But to me, the true thing he really taught me was this line discernment, right? Which is really just decision making, I guess. But he really had a quality to help understand, to help complement, to help contemplate decision making, and not just small decision making, but big decision makings. Now what am I going to do Saturday night? But should I go back to school and study engineering, for instance, which was a profound impact on my life. And George, I remember him talking to me about discernment one time, and I asked him how it was he decided to be a priest. And I thought that was, an interesting choice, life choice. And he went through a story about attending confession and spending time praying, and he was struggling with this enormous calling of some sort that he had inside him, and he couldn't really figure out what it was. And he ran out of the church. I believe this was an Archibald. I wish I knew that fact of the story. But he read a statement on a statue of Thomas Aquinas, and it said it reached inside of him, and he had this enlightening moment, and he knew at that point he wanted to be a priest. And I said, wow, George. I said, how old were you? And he said, 12. And I'm like, oh, man. So this guy, my experience with him from that and then most of my life with him was he really did think differently, or I should say deeply and more completely than I recall coming across. So he really was a compassionate man, and I believe it showed in the way that he at least interacted with his nephew. But I knew him as an uncle, right? So the last line of his obituary was, in his spare time, Father Schemel enjoyed fishing, kite flying, and woodworking. So there's George the fisherman, George with his fishing crew. He had good taste back in the day. And his woodworking. In fact, my son Caleb here has this pepper mill that he made for Caleb's mother and I on our wedding. It's in the down deep in the big thing in the middle. I got to reach all the way down. But he made that at his woodworking lathe here at the university, and I thought that was a kind of cool wedding present. And we've got it here if you want to take a look at it. Or you pass it about. Yeah, and it works. So go back. Sorry. The other thing I remember about George, so my earliest memory about George was actually, he was really a funny individual, like just funny to be around. He had amusing stories all the time. And as a young kid, when your uncle comes, he was one that you looked forward to, right? It wasn't a chore to see him. You didn't have, issues about him being a weird uncle or anything like that. He was just plain fun. I remember one time we lived in Washington, and he was at Warnersville at the time. And he came down, and he had this old car. It was a green car, and it was one of those 60s cars. This would have been the early 1970s. I would have been, like 8, 9, or 10. So, think Jesus Christ Superstar, right? Think of the culture back then. He drove in a 1960 something that was like a beat up old 1960s car then, right? So if you saw that car today, it would look exactly like it did back then, right? It just was this old green thing. And on the back, it had the sticker that said, "This is a God Squad car." And I always thought that was amusing. It got the neighbors' attention. But he was all excited. He got out and he came running across the lawn, and my dad and I were there on this Saturday morning, and he had a cruise control kit that you could put on the car, and he could then use cruise control, which is something we're all used to today, but you bought them at the Ace Hardware and bolted them on your drive shaft. I remember doing that job. And he was all excited about it because he liked to drive Indian style. You know what I mean? Legs crossed, drive down the road, and he saw the cruise control would be his way to do that. So anyway, he was a funny guy with some funny quirks. But that's my earliest continuous memory of him, was that just like those kind of fun things were always coming out of him. So what kind of impact did he have on me? In order to really give you some of that, I want to spend a couple minutes telling you about me and what I do. And I want to stay on time here, so I'm watching this. So I did take an unusual pathway to engineering. So I started out living in DC and moved to Florida when I was 20 years old, and I was working on a degree in criminology. I wanted to go into federal law enforcement, and I had finished that degree. I went to work in the Pinellas County Jail in Florida. So the jail was on the good side of the bars there, not the other side of the bars. But I worked there for about 3 years, a little over 3 years, and it was really an interesting work environment. I mean, everything you can imagine about it, it had. But then on top of that, it was also its own little society in its own right. And I worked for the public defender's office, and I was an interviewer / investigator, is what they called me. And basically, my job was to deal with incoming people that got appointed to the public defender's office that remained in custody. And as I got better at this job, the reward for getting better at that job is you start to deal with more violent criminals, right? So eventually I got out of that line of work. It was just too much. But I remember talking to George about two things with that. One was the work, right? The type of people that I would end up helping, right? So we would help some of the worst of the worst. And we would understand what their crimes were, and we would represent them. And that was our job, and that was our mission. And I took pride in that because it was something nobody really wanted to do. And I remember talking to George about that. And George, he had two things that struck me about it. One was his compassion. Like when you would talk to him about the crime, the victim, and the perpetrator, it's almost as if in his eyes, he'd go to another place and it was almost like he was feeling pain. It was very hard to describe. But like he was very empathetically experiencing the stories I would tell him. But he really did give me sort of the background and the sort of the strength, if you will, to remain in that job while I needed to, while I grew through that. And then it was time to switch. I wanted to go into something else. And I wanted to go from criminology to engineering, to chemical engineering, right? So that's quite a switch. To help me talk through that decision, right? To think about the ways that would work out in my life. And the one thing I remember, I was 24 years old and I went back to school to study engineering. And I said, George, I'll be 30 when I come out, because I was going to get a master's, a bachelor's and a master's. And he said, yeah, Chris, he said, in 5 years, you're going to be 30 anyway. So like you can either do that with an engineering degree or without one. I'm like, all right, well, that sums that up pretty easily. So I took that road and I went back to study engineering at the University of South Florida, where I now am a professor, which is kind of fun. And when I finished, I went to work for the Department of Energy in the nuclear weapons complex. I worked at the Savannah River site, at the Rocky Flats site out in Colorado, and then at the Hanford site. So these are tritium, plutonium, and bomb milling plants, right? So back in the day when we used to make nuclear weapons, these plants were all in full gear on doing that. Most of what I did there in the 90s was the cleanup and the shutdown of those facilities. And that's where I got into fire and explosion work. And that was in weapons protection and facilities protection. So as a chemical engineer working with that experience in fire and explosion, I found out pretty quickly that there's a market for that in consulting, right? So I left, I was a government contractor. I left the company I was with and went to work with a consulting firm. And then became more ingrained in chemical process safety, industrial type incidents and explosions and industrial safety. And then ended up about in 2012 taking on a part-time appointment as an adjunct professor. And now I just was promoted just last week to what's called a professor of practice, which was kind of a nice bump. It's like anybody familiar with universities, you can get a promotion. You're not really sure if it's a promotion, but they tell you it's a promotion. But I think it's a promotion, so we'll go with that. But in my career, I've had the opportunity to travel, right, everywhere. I've been in the Middle East. I have been every place. The only place I haven't really worked is Australia and China. So here's me. This is the mid 2000s in Egypt. So I threw that in there just to brag a little bit. But the type of work we would do over there, I did a fair amount of work for the Saudi Arabian oil company, Saudi Aramco, both in working in their facilities and developing a training program to teach risk, fire protection, and loss prevention within their organization. They're the largest petroleum reserve company in the world, right? So they pump a lot of petroleum products around, a lot of safety issues. And they really engaged becoming world-class in safety back in the early 2000s. And this is the last time I was in Saudi Arabia, was 2016 or 2015. But the area we used to work is up here in the east. just south of Kuwait, and then Dammam area, Al Khobar. And these are the types of work we would do. This is the largest refinery in Saudi Arabia. And we would do fire. This is representing fire models where we would simulate large fires and process equipment or large fires. And these are actually these tank farms back here. This process unit sits over in this region. I don't know exactly where, but it's one of these process units from here. And what we did was looked at the worst possible fires they could have in this refinery and help them figure out, it was a simple question, how big a pump do we need to pump seawater in to put fires out, right? So it sounds like an easy enough question, but that was actually about a year-long project analyzing what their worst fires were and then simulating those fires using computer-aided simulation to predict what it would take to put them out and control them. So that's one type of work we do. Another type of work I do is investigate large-scale incidents. And the largest one I investigated was the Upper Big Branch mine where I worked for Massey Energy, and that as their investigator, 29 miners lost their lives in West Virginia back in 2010, April 5th, 2010. And that was a rather interesting experience. It was a huge investigation. Got me certified as a coal miner, so I can hold that over my family that I have continued the link of coal miners in our family. But that was, I learned a lot there, and that was where I would regularly meet with the 29 victims' families. And I'll tell you what, if there was ever a time I leaned on the type of counseling that George taught me, was talking to those families and talking them through what happened to their loved ones underground. That was hard, and that was very emotional, and it was something that you needed some sort of ability to work yourself through that in your head, right? You couldn't, talking to somebody else might help, but you had to believe that what you were doing meant something. You had to believe what I was coming to learn in life would be a calling, right? That this is what you are there to do. You are there to help these people through this moment, help this company through this moment, and get people back to what they can do. And in that, again, what we would do in that kind of case was we figured out how a mine like that, given the safety systems that are in place, could in fact explode, have an explosion with a footprint like that footprint, which was about 2 miles underground. And this is actually the longwall shear. That was the center part of the explosion. Here's me underground, so I have proof I'm a miner. And then we developed these same sort of computer-aided simulations to look at gas flows. So what happened there was a large gas inundation, and we were able to simulate exactly how that gas moved through that mine face and where it ignited, and then how the explosion propagated. So again, applying these good engineering ideas to investigation this time, not to safety. Another area I work in a lot is over-the-road carriers. It's kind of interesting. So these trucks, this is what they start out at, looking like, and they can end up like this guy, and then we try to figure out exactly what happened. So this is a tank. It's very similar to this one that experienced a detonation, and we were able, again, through metallurgical analysis and blast simulations to reconstruct what happened. It blew up in this site right here, this facility. But again, that kind of forensic work is one of the things that I have a big part of doing. And then wildfires to kind of round out what we do. Wildfires are big in the news. My Ph.D. is actually in the types of fuel beds that support most wildfire fire growth. So this is the Camp Fire, which took out Paradise, California. I was an investigator on that. The Woolsey Fire in Malibu, I was on that fire as well. And this is the Ray Fire in Santa Barbara. And this is me by chance. I thought this was a cool picture. I was working at this field, and the California State Police SWAT team was there. And I got them to take a picture with me. I didn't really do much work with them, but I thought it was a cool picture, so I threw it on there. But wildfires really fascinate me. They were a global event, really. They truly occur on a global scale, and they have a lot of a legacy from global warming, climate conditions, and then they're only going to be getting worse as things go on. So they're an area we really need to understand, an area I spend a lot of time studying, and I'm fascinated by them. In fact, let me get this to play. This runs kind of in the family. This, hope we get video here. So the audio is, if they don't hear it online, it's not that as essential. But this is a wildfire in the Everglades, just south of Miami. The young voice you hear is my son, Caleb. So being a fire scientist, I see a wildfire, I stop. Everybody else, I see a couple other people stop. And then the police came and threw us out, right? They made us leave. But anyway, until that moment, Caleb was having a really good time, and I got a great picture of him with the fire plume. So he enjoyed that. So fire kind of runs in the family. He has this nice to eat you shirt on too there for the shark attacks. And then to kind of round out what I do, the really cool part is I get to do this kind of work Monday through Thursday, if you will. And then I teach at the University of South Florida in Tampa on Fridays. And I can't tell you how much stuff I go through in a typical week. So I teach process safety, which is a required course for all chemical engineers on how not to blow things up. I teach loss prevention, which is more of a management type strategy on how to manage facilities so they run well. And then I teach basic courses in fire dynamics and explosion dynamics. And every week I learn something on the road with my job that I bring back to the students and help them become better, hopefully. Most of my feedback is positive. This is my current undergraduate research group. I just had that photo on my phone, and I'm just impressed with I saw some of the students here today and some of the engineering labs here today that they're building. It never ceased to be impressed with how young people come along, and hate to say it, hope they're not watching, how much smarter they are than the rest of us. So really, kind of in my career, it's got a lot of, there's a lot of, I don't know, trying is the right word, but it's not the easiest job from the sense of I'm always away, right? I'm always away. If you look at my frequent hotel things between my Marriott, my Hilton, I spent 4.5 year nights or whatever they call it out of the last 10 years in a hotel. So about half of my life is spent on the road, either dealing with big problems in facilities, training people, or investigating large-scale incidents that happen. And a lot of people ask me, and then on top of that, I teach, and a lot of people ask me how, why is it that you do that? And, I don't talk a lot about this, but I would bring it up here because I think it's important. Until last week when they promoted me, I volunteered that time. So for 10 years, I taught as a volunteer as a professor, full-time, one class, because the word calling comes to mind when I think about George and the way he talked about his calling. And when I was preparing for this talk, that really is what I think he gave to me, was that idea of what a calling is. And when I dissect his obituary a bit, right? That George was an extraordinary teacher who gave himself wholeheartedly to the study of Ignatius Loyola. Well, I'd like to think I'm extraordinary. I get pretty good reviews, but let's just say I'm good. And I do get reviews that I'm passionate about my subject. And I don't teach the Ignatian spiritual exercises, but I like to think that I meet that with him, that he showed me what it was like to be a teacher. By example, he taught me things that when I went on to get spiritual guidance, formal spiritual guidance, and formal spiritual counseling later, it was very much in tune with the example and the life lessons that he taught me that I just saw in him. So that I feel like I'm trying to hit that first one with him. Respected in the US and around the world, again, not for my spirituality, but if you need something blown up or burned, I'm your guy. But really, I've had the opportunity to travel the world. I've had the opportunity to work in cultures around the world and approach those cultures with the kind of open-mindedness that my uncle approached me and my things that I came to him with in life. And that always struck me about him, that no matter what I would talk to him about, and I went through a couple of tough decisions with him. He was always non-judgmental, no matter what it was. The judgment was not on the table. What is it we do about this was on the table. And it was a perspective that I strive for, but that, you really do. You rarely see, and you rarely allow yourself that, I find. So when I wrap this kind of up, what I really think that my time with my uncle really taught me, I say taught me or showed me, I could use there too, how to truly enjoy life. One of the things I think I would put my happiness level against anybody's, okay? I love what I do. I love that what I teach. I love the time I get with my kids. I even love the time with my brother. But I am one of the happiest people I know. And that might sound like an odd thing to say, but it is true. And I got that from George. George was always, when I saw him, one of the happiest people I was around. He just had a big smile on his face, and he was always ready to go, whatever was next. To work tirelessly. And that man worked tirelessly. And I like to think that I am somehow striving to work tirelessly and to do what you love. And I am truly blessed to do what I love. I love fire. If you had me here to talk about fire, you'd be in that seat another 4 or 5 hours, because I could talk about fire forever. But I truly love what I do. I love teaching. And I think that when I sum it up, and with the contemplation, if you will, that I've had about putting this talk together, I really believe he showed me what a calling was and how to live a calling. And on that, I will wrap. I will turn over to my brother, and I will note my perfection that I was right on time with 25 minutes. So take that. Now I've got to rig him up here. Hold on just a second. Oh, okay.
This is enough?
Say something.
Thank you, Chris. Is this working? Okay, great. Take the far seat. Thank you, Chris, and congratulations on being promoted to a professor of practice. To my knowledge, you're among the first to be promoted in the state of Florida. Yeah. So congratulations. That's quite an accomplishment. You didn't get out of your PowerPoints, brother. Okay. Yeah, but I think I'm going to use Hebrew first. Okay. So what I want to talk about today is my relationship with Uncle George. And I'm on slideshow. Why aren't you? Okay, I see. And particularly how he influenced me, okay? And the fundamental influence he had on me was to instill in me the belief that the deepest desire of the human heart is to receive unconditional love. And as we grow in receiving unconditional love, we learn to return it. Most of us learn this from our families. If we have good parents, we have good families, we learn that we can receive unconditional love and that we can return it. If we don't learn that, we run into trouble. George was my most important mentor, and I believe he had more impact on my development, both my psychological development and my spiritual development, than anyone. So what I want to talk about today was some of the models and techniques that George taught within a religious context. I can't talk about a Jesuit priest who is a Roman Catholic without some mention of his religion and how he used religious models in my education. But I also want to show how these methods and models can be adapted to a more secular environment. So they're not exclusively religious, I would claim. They can be adapted and then thus have a wider appeal if we adapt them to a secular environment. First and foremost, I'd have to say that George was a man who was deeply committed to his faith. I don't know anyone who was more committed to his faith than my Uncle George. People who were as committed, but no one who is more committed to their faith. And what do I mean by faith? Fair question. Huh? To me, faith is a decision to accept a particular fundamental interpretation of reality, though there are alternative, reasonable interpretations. If you disagree with that, let it come out in the question and answer session, okay? The faith is a decision to accept a particular fundamental interpretation of reality, though there are alternative, reasonable interpretations. Do atheists and agnostics have faith? Yes, of course, obviously, because they have made a decision to accept a particular fundamental interpretation of reality, although there are alternative, reasonable explanations. So you don't have to incorporate metaphysical elements into your faith system to have faith. You can exclude them if that's your decision. Now, the strength of our faith will show in the degree to which it guides our actions, our thoughts, our emotions, and the degree to which other beliefs and assumptions adhere to it. So the more we see this, the more we can say a person's faith is strong. And as I knew George, this happened to the fullest degree that I've seen. So, receiving and giving unconditional love is our deepest desire. Now, I developed this conviction over several retreats with Uncle George. He modified the Ignatian retreats. And typically, when I would take a retreat from him, the first day was contemplating lines from the book of Isaiah, chapter 49. And chapter 49 of Isaiah is an interesting chapter because it starts with the prophet speaking to the islands and the distant nations, as well as Israel and the house of Jacob. So the prophet is saying, I'm addressing everybody, including Israel. So George said he's addressing every single individual in humanity. When God, through Isaiah, makes these statements in chapter 49, I have called you by your name, and you are mine. Look, I have carved your name in the palm of my hand. Can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion for the child she has borne? Though she may forget, I will never forget you. Now, George would have one contemplate these passages, or one of these passages, for 1 hour, 3 times a day. And through that method, I became convinced that whoever spoke these lines loved me unconditionally. And that came to satisfy the deepest desire of my heart. And when I talk to people, when I cut through and cut to the quick, I find that in the hundreds of people I have spoken to, with possibly one exception, although I wonder if that really was an exception, unconditional love, receiving it and returning it, is the deepest desire of everyone. And if you want me to demonstrate that, ask me to do so in the question and answer session, and I'll be happy to demonstrate it for you. Okay. The belief that love is the deepest desire is fully compatible with any faith system, including secularism, secular humanism, as well as faith system excluding the metaphysical in any way. How can I make that claim? I borrow from a few concepts. First is Emerson's concept of the oversoul. The first time the term was mentioned was 1841 in a paper written by Emerson. He says, and I'm abridging, of course, what he said, that unity, that oversoul within which every man's particular being is concentrated and made one with all others, that common heart. So he's saying there's something out there that ties everyone together. Now, Carl Gustav Jung, the great psychoanalyst, read Emerson and was very, very impressed by him. So he came up with the concept, modifying Emerson a bit, of the collective unconsciousness. And he said that in the collective unconsciousness are stored universal concepts, images, and ways of thinking. We see similarities, he said, in virtually every culture, even in cultures never having contact with one another, separated by great distance and by time. Expressions are adapted to culture, but similar in their deep meanings. And he said that the oversoul is inherited. It has to do, he said, with the structure, a shared structure that everyone has in their brain. Today, we'd say it has genetic causation. Uncle George liked Jung a lot and liked this concept a lot. Now, my claim is that the desire for unconditional love is an element of the human oversoul. I have some evidence that I'll offer for that. You can evaluate it. One is that love seems to exist in all cultures. Second, love has a survival value. Why do I make these claims? Well, what's love? Let's look at that first. I say love is using, did I skip that? Yeah, love is working for the benefit of others in the spirit of goodwill. That's how I define love. Because I cannot think of something that I'd call love that doesn't involve working for the benefit of others in the spirit of goodwill. Can any of you? If you can, bring it up in the question and answer session, okay? But when I would talk about this to my students, a lot of, well, not a lot, but a good number of students would object. And particularly they'd say, well, you know, when I'm next to my sweetheart, I feel warm, fuzzy feelings, and I don't have to work at it. Well, they're making a couple of mistakes, but to avoid having to debate with them, I would change my description, my definition of love to love is using our life energy for the benefit of others in the spirit of goodwill. Basically the same, right? And I'd get less objection to that. Now, another thing we want to look at is the claim that receiving unconditional love is genetically determined. Huh? Now, the anthropologists tell us that from the earliest times, Homo sapiens lived in groups. Why did they do that? Well, because it helped them meet the most fundamental challenge that the environment poses to them, which is survival. And love helped the members of a group to survive. It was an additional element that enhanced a group's ability to survive. Why? Well, if the members of a group are working for one another in the spirit of goodwill, they have a greater chance of surviving than a group that's not doing that, where it's everyone for himself. Huh? And we can see this in the cooperation of human beings, can't we? How did human beings bring down a cave bear? They cooperated with one another. How did they bring down a woolly mammoth? They worked with one another in the spirit of goodwill, I would assume most of the time, for the benefit of the group. If you disagree with that analysis, bring it up in the question and answer session, huh? Now, the mistake my students were making when they said, I can feel warm fuzzy when, being next to the one I love and it doesn't take work, is that they were equating love with emotion. And that's a mistake, because love is not an emotion. Love has emotional correlates, but it is not an emotion in and of itself. It is a choice to work for another for their benefit in the spirit of goodwill. Consider what an emotion is and the relationship of emotion to love. I haven't yet found a description of emotion, a definition of emotion in general that I like. I haven't. Okay. A lot of times I come upon some description or definition of emotion, and then it goes right into a list. Right? Emotion is a feeling, and then it lists. Now they're up to 18 emotions. Okay? But it doesn't tell me what all these emotions have in common. So I came up with my own description because I didn't find one I liked. To me, emotion has two dimensions. One is intensity. We feel an emotion to some degree of intensity. And the other dimension is a dimension of either attraction or what I'll call disattraction. And I have to coin this term. Why do I have to coin that term? Because every time I look at an antonym of attraction, it goes to the extreme, right? Disgust, horror, right? And you can be mildly disattracted to something, right? You can dislike or just be disattracted to a little bit, but be able to sit through the concert, right? And there is a word unattraction, but it has the same problem. When I looked at synonyms for that word, like 20 of the synonyms had the same issue. They went to extremes. Only one word was a bit moderate. And I said, I'm not going to choose a word that's so overloaded with synonyms that go to the extreme. So while this may appear to be dichotomous, it's actually two scales next to one another, right? We can feel low to high attraction, we can feel low to high disattraction, and we can feel various degrees of intensity. So tell me an emotion that can't fit in this matrix. One student said, okay, feeling nothing for someone. He's hurt me so much, he's cheated on me so much, I feel nothing for him. I said, okay, that's no intensity and right here. Not attracted to, not disattracted, but it's right here. But I suspect it could also have a high degree of disattraction, though it's not really felt much. Ambivalence, somebody said. Well, that would simply be two plots on the matrix, wouldn't it? Anybody else want to give me something that would challenge this model? Yeah, I can't think of something that something I'd call an emotion that doesn't fit here. Okay. If you can bring it out in the question and answer session. Now, my description of love brings up a problem, doesn't it? What about self-love? Because as I describe love, it's an other direction, an other directed emotion, right? So what do we say about self-love? I think it's misnamed. Rather than say self-love is necessary, I would say that what's necessary is the conviction that we are worthy of love and that we have to treat ourselves well so that we can better love others. But we're worthy of love, and we receive it either from some metaphysical elements or we receive it because we're part of the human oversoul. It's our birthright. It's there, it's ours. But I've seen so many people run into problems with loving themselves. And when I say to them, stop worrying about that. Just decide that you're worthy of love. And if they're religious, I use the metaphysical argument. And if they're not, I talk to them about the human oversoul. And they seem to have an easier time dealing with that. You may have had a different experience, okay? And you can bring that up in the question and answer session, huh? Oh, okay, I see why I'm going backward. Now, George loved this curve, and he used it. He used it first to explain a phenomenon in physics, superconductivity. He'd explain that to a group. The phenomenon that as certain metals are reduced in temperature, their efficiency at conducting electricity increases exponentially as the temperature approaches absolute zero. And George was once appointed by the Vatican to a committee to examine whether or not a candidate for canonization should make it, right? Should this person be canonized or not? George was devil's advocate. He did his job very well. The person was not nominated by the committee, right? And George said, borrowing from his religious model, that being a saint is something like, well, the fundamental charge of the committee, let me mention that, was, did this person follow the whim of the Holy Spirit, at least in the last few years of their life? And George said it was something like the phenomenon of superconductivity, okay? As you approach absolute zero, you become more efficient at bringing the love of God into the world, right? As you get to 98%, you're really doing good. At 99%, you're really doing better. At 100%, woo, that's a saint. Now, let's step into a more secular explanation, but borrow from the concept that George used. Love, okay, what's the Holy Spirit in the Christian thinking? One of his characteristics is infinite love, right? Infinite love, that's a quality of the Holy Spirit. But we don't need to reference that. We can say the degree to which you can bring love into the world increases exponentially the more you give yourself as you approach giving yourself totally to love. 97%, you're doing pretty good. 98%, you're doing better. 99%, you're doing real good. But it's a lot less than 100%. So, you want to bring love into the world? I think George would say, give yourself totally to it, and then we're going to see some real change. But George also said, now here's a paradox. He said that perfection is not an endpoint, but a constant growth. So how do we bring together his belief that a saint reaches the endpoint of giving themselves 100% to the love of God, and that perfection is a process of continuously growing closer, but never reaching an endpoint? How do we bring those together? Well, let me tell you a story. Brother Gaetan is a brother at the Abbey of Gethsemane, and he worked in the Abbey's store. Me and one of my buddies, Father Peter, worked in the Abbey store of our monastery. And twice a year, there would be the Southeast Regional Show in downtown Atlanta, a huge retail show. And we would all go to it, and it took us about 3 days to visit the entire show. And we'd see what particular items we could buy that we thought would be appropriate for the store and that would sell. And when we were going after one evening, after we left the show, going to Five Guys for dinner, right, Brother Gaetan mentioned in the conversation that he had read over 300 books on the lives of saints. And I thought, that's interesting, because one of the things George told me was that one quality of saints is kindness. If you're a saint, you have to show me the quality of kindness. And some of the saints he thought never should be saints because they weren't kind. Okay. Now, I told Brother Gaetan what George said. Saint has to be kind. And I said, do you agree with that, Brother Gaetan? You've read 300 books on the lives of the saints. And Brother Gaetan said, yes, but. Brother Gaetan explained that most saints are left with a flaw. And the flaw that most of them are left with is anger. They'll blow up, get in a rage, right? And then they'll beat themselves up for days, even weeks afterwards. Why did I do that? Then they'll calm down and return to normal until they blow up again. And he said, God allows that so that they stay humble. Because without humility, you're not going to be open to the spirit of love. You're going to think you have it made. So the thought I glean from that is that perhaps this 100% perfection, where we exponentially bring love to the world, can mean that we never quite reach what we'd call perfect. That we're always going to have a flaw. And often it might be anger. But as long as we can retain humility and return to that spirit of love and hope for forgiveness, especially from those we've offended, that is what perfection, that is what reaching 100% might be. 100% love. And then we're talking about changing a good part of the world. Okay, thank you very much for your attention, folks.
want to.
Okay, question and answer session.
Yeah.
Yes.
Please.
Me or my brother?
For you.
Okay.
For both.
Yeah, sure.
Because of your definitions. You said that love is for the benefit of others with an accompanying goodwill. I think that's.
Not quite. I said love is working for the benefit of others in the spirit of goodwill.
Yes. Okay. So to me, that suggests someone who's functioning, working, and benefit. So if I saw a burning house and heard a little baby crying, and I went in and rescued that baby before the house collapsed, I would not consider that love. I would say that love is something that has to include within its definition an interpersonal relationship, something where I relate to you directly in a way. So I'm just suggesting that I'm quarreling a little bit with your definition of love.
Sure. I would answer that that is an act of love, and that the person who rushes into the house to save the baby has an interpersonal relationship with that baby. And every time the baby's mom reminds that baby as he grows into a boy, into a teenager and an adult, about this person who rushed into the house to save him, he should feel some sense of gratitude, of love toward the guy who did that.
But isn't that duty rather than love?
Isn't that
duty rather than love?
Love can be an act of duty, sure.
Let me chime in. So as somebody who deals with a lot of people in first responding, there's a lot of I would tend to agree with you. I think that the duty or the it's almost that the baby's an object if that's truly the mode you go into to rescue somebody. So it's, there might not be a personal connection. You might argue it's an act of greater love for society. I don't know. That's not my bin, but I know what you're saying. And a sense of duty, I think, is because that scenario, I can see it. I can see offering rescue to somebody, helping them, and then literally walking away and never contacting that person again or thinking about that person again. And I think that's in the spirit of what you're saying.
What we're seeing is a confusion between emotion.
I didn't want to inject a.
That's okay.
Oh no, we got to get it.
We got a good conversation going here. What we're seeing is a confusion between emotion and love. Love is not an emotion. And what we see in the case of a first responder is discipline. They discipline their emotion. It's like saying a psychiatrist and a patient, a psychiatrist has to maintain distance from the patient. That's not true. A psychiatrist has to maintain discipline because the relationship between a psychiatrist and a patient is very intimate and maybe primarily one way, but it's very intimate. And what the psychiatrist has to do is to maintain discipline. I was talking last night to a nurse. She said, yeah, we have feelings for the patients, but we have to discipline it. And, I know nurses, I know doctors, and every time I've said this to them, they agree. You have to discipline the emotion. Don't confuse the discipline of emotion with the lack of love. Love is an act to benefit another, done in the spirit of goodwill. Then you can walk away. It's not that you feel nothing, it's that you have disciplined your emotion so that you feel very little intensity.
I just think that's overreach.
Okay, this is
It's for the TV.
this is a comment for Chris. I've been to a lot of graduations from Jesuit colleges, and Jesuits are often speaking. And actually, Father Pallars, our former president, often would say this, and I wonder if George said this. Saint Ignatius says, go set the world on fire.
I would love to say, yes, he said that to me, and I might adopt that in a few years as my memory shifts, but no, he did not. But George, I guess, again, what I would come back to is the things I saw in him, the way he lived his life and the way he treated me. As I went on to study spiritual exercises with some Jesuits later, I saw it was like I knew a lot of the things they would talk to me about. So I think in that sense, he did light a fire, if you will, by his example. But yeah, he truly was tireless, and I think that captures that spirit well. But yeah, if that's what when you read about the early Jesuits and taking off to South America and putting up with all they did, it's like you can see that spirit. Nothing against modern day Jesuits, but it's not living in the jungle, and the same sort of thing. But anyway, I like that saying. Not familiar with it though.
I have a question also from Mario. What did George think about Padre Pio? Or maybe you don't know the story.
George did not think Padre Pio should be declared a saint because he was unkind. Unkind. He was not kind, in George's opinion.
To George.
I'm sorry?
Did he ever do anything to George?
Yes. George interviewed him when he was a student at the Pontifical Biblical Institute, and Padre Pio was not kind to Uncle George. He was also not kind to his sister when she left religious life, in George's opinion.
What a pleasure to hear from both of you, each from your own perspective. And I'm sure that you both have to know that Sandra and her cohorts have done a beyond exceptional job in upholding the tenets that you speak of your uncle. I'm sure that's true, and your family name. But my question, I think, is for Chris. Did your brief time in criminology impact in any way or ways your work in chemical engineering? I guess I'm thinking of the fire explosions across our country, and criminality is involved in some of them. Would you address that, please?
Yeah. So absolutely, my work in criminology taught me, wow, way beyond fire and explosion and engineering. It taught me ways of dealing with groups of people. It taught me there's good in people that even do horrible, horrible, evil things, that is a segment of who they are. Often, right? I think I might have met in 3.5 years of working in a 3,000 man facility with a lot of turnover, two, well, I was going to say one that I would say would be, in my head, truly evil. Everybody else had moments of normality to them. And that taught me a great lesson about dealing with people and understanding people. And then on a brief note, the fact that we have our first, not to be political, Supreme Court justice now was a public defender. To me, it was mind-boggling to me that nobody had even been a criminal defense attorney on the Supreme Court. So I think that's a huge move. But as far as working within engineering, it certainly gave me for lack of a better word, thicker skin of having seen really quite a lot of violence in that environment, and being able to work through that violence. To the comment I hear a lot when I just this middle of last month walked into a fire that was basically still getting put out, huge factory, big client, massive loss, all kinds of chaos about production, how they're going to meet production schedules. And at the end of each day, people look at me and they say, man, you come through this, so calmly. And so, you help us through this whole thing. And I'm like, well, one thing, I've done this a lot, but those 3 years working in that environment taught me just to expect the unexpected, and to, I think that idea of compassion, no matter what comes at you, you've got to be compassionate with the people coming at you, even if they're violent or whatever the thing is. You've got to be able to work through that. And that gave me sort of a base of emotional stability, I think, in my professional life. I interviewed men that were chained to a chair naked so they wouldn't hurt me, right? So when I would go to meetings when I was with the Department of Energy, I remember walking into one when I was early on, and somebody said, "Oh, I got to be careful. This guy's tough." I'm thinking in my head, I bet he's not chained to the chair naked so he doesn't attack me, right? So you can't be that tough. But no, that was probably one of the most valuable experiences of my life. It was tough to go through. You learn a lot, but I think it helped me not just in engineering, but across the board, and how I treat people, and how I understand where different people come from and their perspectives.
Did you feel some burnout?
I felt, I wouldn't say burnout. What I saw was looking at the men and women that had been in that field for 20 plus years, that they looked to me like they experienced a lot of burnout. I was getting advice from some of them that was like, the field is changing, with corruption, with different issues, and they just didn't think it was for me. And I listened to that advice. And again, I think that was one of the things that, again, with George, he taught you to keep all your senses open and to disseminate that information, in your own time and in your own way. But yeah, I have a lot of respect for people that are still in that field, especially the in custody work, because that's thankless work, and it's good work. It has to be done, and it has to be done compassionately. But it would have overwhelmed me, I think. So.
I just want to give a further response to the question about Padre Pio. George investigated 20 cases of stigmata in Europe when he was at the Pontifical Biblical Institute. The only ones he told me about, he did not believe had any spiritual connection. For example, one was a woman in Sweden who was a prostitute. The story of Teresa Newman, you might be familiar with. He knew that at the time her stigmata and excessive bleeding occurred, her period stopped. So he believed that these periods of ecstasy and bleeding had some kind of a sexual connection.
This is a question for brother. Would you please explain a little bit about what you mean by oversoul?
Oversoul was a concept used by Emerson. He writes beautifully in a paper. He wrote a series of papers for publication, and in one of them, he talks about the unity of all persons. It's very mystical. He talks about it as being a very good thing and leading us to good and letting us know when we're not doing good. Jung was impressed by this concept and turned it into something different in the collective unconsciousness, which is something every human being shares because their brain is structured in part in very similar ways. He said evidence for this is similarities we see in cultures separated by large distances, separated in time. For example, one of the things that really bothers me is when I hear someone say, "Oh, this culture is very different from that culture." No, it's totally different from that culture. No, it's not. Mothers love their children. They eat to live. It may be very different, but no culture is totally different from any other.
I'd like to continue the Q&A with some food and drink in the outer place here. I think it would be a good idea, but before I do that, I want to thank you for the provocative uh, interesting thoughts that you've brought to us today. And I think that we'll certainly continue the talk out there, but far, far more than that. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
You do your job. You weren't nonplussed by what was going on. Nice.